In the flickering torchlight of the Palatine Hill, young Nero learned early that every smile hid a blade. He watched the courtiers bow low before his mother, their words sweet as honey yet sharp enough to draw blood. The boy's small hands clenched at his sides as he stood half hidden behind a marble column, listening to plans that never included his name aloud. The palace breathed with tension, each breath measured against the risk of being overheard. His father's presence had once anchored the household, a blunt soldier whose laughter could silence a room. Yet that anchor slipped without warning. One evening the man returned from the forum, pale and short of breath. Servants rushed past with cloths and bowls, their faces tight. Nero pressed himself against the wall, heart hammering, as the door to the inner chamber closed with a sound like final stone. Silence followed, thick and unbroken. No one explained why the great man's eyes had grown glassy or why the physicians withdrew, shaking their heads. The boy felt the shift in the air before anyone spoke the word that changed everything. Power, once a distant rumor, now pressed close to his throat like an unseen hand. His mother's gaze turned sharper, calculating the value of a son left fatherless at so tender an age. Whispers traveled the marble halls faster than any messenger. Senators who had once dined at the family table now spoke of alliances and futures that did not include the dead man's name. Agrippina moved through those conversations with quiet command, her voice low yet impossible to ignore. Nero trailed behind her, learning which doors to linger near and which glances meant danger. The loss carved space inside him where fear and hunger began to trade places. Each night the lamps burned later in the study. Scrolls arrived bearing seals that had never appeared before. Men in togas arrived at odd hours, their sandals scuffing the floor as they bent close to his mother. Nero caught fragments, names, sums, promises, and stored them like coins. The palace taught him that grief was a luxury no one could afford for long. He practiced stillness, the kind that let others forget he listened. One afternoon the summons came. Nero stood before a circle of men whose faces he had seen only from a distance. Their eyes weighed him as if measuring cloth for a new robe. His mother's hand rested lightly on his shoulder, a reminder rather than a comfort. Words passed above his head: guardianship, inheritance, the emperor's favor. The boy kept his chin lifted, though his stomach turned. Outside, rain struck the roof tiles in steady rhythm, marking time the way the powerful marked lives. In the weeks that followed, the household changed shape. Familiar slaves vanished, new faces appeared, their loyalty sworn to the living rather than the dead. Nero walked the garden paths alone more often, the scent of clipped laurel sharp in his nostrils. He replayed the last evening with his father, the rough hand on his hair, the half-finished story, until the memory grew thin. Each recollection sharpened the lesson that nothing lasted unless seized and held. The boy began to notice how silence could be weaponized. When a rival's name surfaced at dinner, the pause that followed carried more weight than any rebuke. Nero practiced that pause himself, letting it stretch until the other speaker grew uneasy. The skill felt like armor, thin at first, yet worth forging. Outside the walls, Rome continued its noisy business, but inside the palace, every footstep echoed with consequence. By the time the formal mourning ended, Nero understood the path ahead. His father's death had cleared ground that others now sought to claim. He would not stand aside. The same corridors that had once felt endless now seemed like a map he could read. Each turn offered either shelter or exposure. He chose his steps with care, already tasting the future that waited beyond the next shadowed archway. By the time the formal mourning ended, Nero understood the path ahead. His father's death had cleared ground that others now sought to claim. He would not stand aside. The same corridors that had once felt endless now seemed like a map he could read. Each turn offered either shelter or exposure. He chose his steps with care, already tasting the future that waited beyond the next shadowed archway. Seneca met him in a private chamber lit only by a single brazier. The philosopher's eyes held the weight of years at court. Together they shaped the words that would claim the throne. Nero listened as Seneca outlined the risks. Every ally could become a rival. Every promise demanded repayment in blood or favor. The young man felt the fire stir in his chest. He spoke the necessary oaths with a voice that carried farther than his years suggested. Messengers rode out before dawn. The Praetorian Guard received their gifts and their orders. By midday, the legions in the city had sworn their loyalty. Nero stood before the assembled troops and felt the earth shift beneath him. The crown was his now, yet the weight pressed against his ribs like an unseen hand. Seneca remained at his side through the first audiences. The older man's counsel flowed steady and measured. He warned against haste. He advised measured responses to the Senate's first cautious congratulations. Nero nodded at each point. Inside him, the tension coiled tighter. He had seized what belonged to him. Still, the victory tasted of ash. Whispers already moved through the marble halls. Some spoke of Claudius's sudden end. Others wondered what the new emperor would demand in return for peace. In the Senate chamber, the air grew thick with false warmth. Senators rose to praise the young ruler. Their words rang hollow beneath the vaulted ceiling. Nero sat upon the raised seat and watched their faces. One man smiled too broadly. Another avoided his gaze. A third shifted in his seat as if the marble burned him. The knives were not yet drawn, but the hands that would wield them rested close to their sides. He returned to his private quarters that evening with Seneca at his elbow. The philosopher spoke of laws to reform and enemies to watch. Nero heard the advice. He also heard the silence between the sentences. The court had not finished choosing sides. Some would bend, others would wait for weakness. He paced the length of the room while the lamps flickered. Each shadow seemed to stretch longer than the last. The first test came swiftly. A delegation arrived with questions about provincial taxes. Their polite inquiries masked deeper probes into his resolve. Nero answered as Seneca had prepared him, yet he saw the glances exchanged when they thought him turned away. The stakes rose with every word spoken in that room. One misstep could invite open challenge. One sign of doubt could embolden those who preferred another name on the throne. Night fell across the Palatine. Nero stood at a high window and looked down at the city. Torches moved along the streets like distant fireflies. Somewhere below, men plotted in low voices. He could almost feel their words rising through the stones. The empire stretched beyond these walls. Its loyalty depended on what he did next. He drew a slow breath and let the silence settle around him. The future would not wait for hesitation. Seneca joined him again before the lamps were trimmed. They reviewed the day's encounters. Each name carried a note of caution or opportunity. Nero listened and remembered every detail. The philosopher's presence steadied him, yet even Seneca could not quiet the sense that unseen eyes followed every movement. The Senate had offered its surface loyalty. Beneath that surface, the old factions stirred. In the days that followed, Nero walked the same corridors with new purpose. He greeted petitioners, he issued edicts, he hosted the necessary feasts. Through it all, the feeling remained. Knives waited in the shadows. Some belonged to men he had once called friends. Others belonged to strangers who saw only a boy wearing an emperor's name. He kept his own counsel tighter than before. Every smile he returned carried an edge of calculation. The throne was his. Holding it would demand more than crowns and oaths. It would demand vigilance that never slept. The vigilance never slept, yet it could not quiet the voice that had shaped his every step since boyhood. Agrippina's shadow still stretched across the palace halls, her counsel arriving like commands dressed as advice. Nero felt the weight of it each morning when he woke to find her already seated in the audience chamber, eyes sharp, ready to steer the empire she claimed to have given him. He had tried to ease her grip with distance and small refusals. They only sharpened her determination. She arranged meetings without his leave, dismissed officials he favored, and spoke of restoring the old order in which a mother's hand guided the throne. The son who once sought her approval now tasted bitterness in every embrace. One evening, the breaking point arrived without fanfare. Agrippina entered his private rooms unannounced, her voice low and insistent as she pressed for the removal of yet another rival. Nero listened in silence, the lamplight throwing her face into hard lines. When she finished, he offered only a nod. The nod was not agreement. It was the first measured step away from her. The plan formed in the quiet hours that followed. He would not strike in anger or in the open. A single order, delivered through trusted intermediaries, would carry the weight of finality. The ship was prepared with care, its hull weakened just enough to fail at sea. Agrippina would board it as a gesture of reconciliation, and the sea would finish what words could no longer contain. He signed the command in the dead of night, the stylus pressing into wax with a sound that seemed louder than it should. The room held its breath around him. No witnesses stood near, yet the act felt witnessed by every ancestor whose blood he carried. When the messenger departed, Nero remained seated, staring at the empty space where the tablet had rested. The silence pressed close, heavy and absolute. Word reached him days later that the vessel had foundered and that Agrippina had survived the wreck, only to be overtaken on shore. The second attempt required no further signature, only the absence of countermand. He gave that absence willingly. When confirmation arrived that she was dead, he received the report without expression, then dismissed the room with a wave that felt heavier than any spoken order. The stain settled slowly. At first it was only a tightening in the chest each time her name was spoken in council. Then it became the knowledge that every future decision would be measured against this one. Allies who had urged caution now measured their own safety by how far they stood from the memory of the mother he had removed. Enemies who once feared her now feared the son who had dared to end her. Nero walked the gardens that night, the air cool against his skin. He paused at the fountain where she had once taught him the names of the stars. The water moved without sound, reflecting a sky that offered no judgment. He turned away before the reflection could hold his gaze too long. The throne remained his. The cost of keeping it had been written in a single command that no future decree could erase. Nero lingered among the shadowed paths a moment longer, the weight of that single command pressing against his ribs like an unhealed wound. Then, the first distant shouts reached the palace. Smoke curled over the rooftops, thick and acrid, carrying the crackle of timber and the panicked cries of a city waking to its own destruction. He moved at once, calling for his guards, though the order felt hollow even as he spoke it. The fire had begun in the Circus Maximus, they told him, and it leapt from street to street with a hunger no bucket line could quench. By the time he reached the Palatine, the sky above the Subura glowed red, a false dawn that turned night into something merciless. Flames raced along the wooden insulae, devouring tenements floor by floor. People spilled into the alleys, clutching bundles and children, their faces streaked with soot and terror. Nero watched from the height of his terrace as entire blocks collapsed inward, sending sparks spiraling upward like vengeful stars. The heat reached him even there, drying his throat and stinging his eyes. He felt the city's pulse falter beneath the roar. Rumors traveled faster than the fire itself. Whispers already named him the author of the blaze, claiming he had ordered the burning to clear space for a grander palace. The accusations spread from mouth to mouth in the refugee camps outside the walls, growing bolder with each retelling. Senators who had once bowed low now measured their distance from him in the torchlight, their eyes sharp with calculation. Survival demanded an answer, yet every answer risked tightening the noose. He ordered relief measures at first, grain distributions, temporary shelters in the Campus Martius, water brought in from the aqueducts still intact. The gestures brought a fragile calm, but they did nothing to quiet the murmurs that he had sung while Rome burned. He had not sung, he had stood silent, watching the horizon devour itself. Yet silence had its own price. The mob needed a face for its rage, and his was the most visible. In the days that followed, the fire consumed the heart of the city. The forum lay in ash, temples crumbled, the house of the Vestals was gone. Each report reached him with the same grim cadence, and each time the question returned: who would carry the blame so that the throne might remain secure? His advisors spoke of the Christians, that obscure sect already distrusted for refusing the old gods. They were few, already hated, and their refusal to sacrifice offered a ready narrative. Blame them, and the city's fury would turn elsewhere. Spare them, and the whispers against the emperor might harden into open revolt. Nero walked the length of his audience chamber as the decision took shape. The air smelled of charred wood and distant rain. He thought of the throne's cost, already paid in blood once before, and wondered how many more lives the same command might claim. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying fresh smoke through the open colonnade. He stopped at the window, and looked down at the blackened streets where survivors picked through rubble. The choice was no longer between guilt and innocence. It was between the emperor and the mob that could unmake him. He gave the order before dawn. Soldiers moved through the remaining districts, rounding up the followers of the Nazarene carpenter. Their arrests drew cheers from the crowds still homeless and hungry. The Christians were paraded, condemned, and offered as spectacle in the arena, living torches to light the rebuilding games. The city exhaled, its anger redirected, its wounds bandaged with borrowed blood. Nero stood once more on the terrace as the first new foundations were laid. The fire had passed, yet its heat lingered in every stone. He had chosen survival, the throne remained his, and the gardens below waited in silence for whatever judgment the reflected stars might still withhold. From the terrace where the reflected stars held their silent judgment, Nero stepped back into the palace corridors, his footsteps echoing like distant thunder. The fire's ashes still clung to the air, yet his thoughts had already shifted beyond reconstruction. Paranoia coiled tighter around his heart with every passing hour. Rivals whispered in corners he could not see, and he resolved to silence them before their words took root. He summoned his closest advisers under the cover of darkness. One by one, they reported names of senators who questioned the emperor's divine right. Nero listened without interruption, his eyes fixed on the flickering lamps. Then he issued the orders with a voice that brooked no delay. Executions followed swiftly, carried out in quiet chambers rather than public squares. The bodies vanished into the Tiber before dawn, leaving only rumors to spread like smoke. The city watched in uneasy silence as these purges unfolded. Nero demanded more than obedience now. He required worship. Statues rose in his likeness across the forums, adorned with garlands and offerings that once belonged to the old gods. Priests were compelled to include his name in their invocations, their voices trembling as they proclaimed him the son of Jupiter. Any hesitation invited suspicion, and suspicion invited death. The people complied outwardly, their cheers hollow echoes in the arenas where games resumed under his watchful eye. Generals on the frontiers felt the shift most acutely. Messages arrived daily from Rome, laced with veiled threats and demands for absolute loyalty. One commander in Gaul received a letter that praised his victories while reminding him of fallen predecessors. He read it by torchlight in his tent, the words settling like a noose. His officers exchanged glances heavy with unspoken fear. They had sworn oaths to the empire, not to a man who saw enemies in every ally. Quiet meetings followed in shadowed tents, where plans for resistance began to form without ever being named aloud. Senators in the capital fared no better. Those who survived the initial purges gathered in private villas, their conversations guarded by trusted slaves. They spoke of the emperor's growing madness, in tones barely above a murmur. One elder among them recalled the days when the Senate held real power, his words drawing nods from the others. Yet fear kept their discussions from action. Each man wondered who among them might already be reporting back to the palace. The weight of potential betrayal pressed down like an unseen hand, stifling any bold move. Nero sensed the unrest without needing reports. He appeared in the Senate chamber unannounced one afternoon, his presence alone enough to still every tongue. He spoke of unity and divine favor, his gaze sweeping the rows of seated men. A long silence followed his departure, broken only by the scrape of sandals on marble. No one dared voice dissent there, but the seeds of revolt took deeper hold in private hearts. As weeks passed, the tension thickened. Generals delayed their returns to Rome, citing border threats that grew more urgent with each dispatch. Senators hosted fewer public events, their households fortified against midnight visitors. Nero withdrew further into his inner circle, surrounded by flatterers who fed his suspicions. The arena games continued as a distraction, yet even the roar of crowds could not drown the gathering storm. In the quiet hours before dawn, the emperor paced his chambers alone, convinced that every shadow concealed a knife. The empire held its breath, its foundations cracking under the strain of one man's unyielding will. In those shadowed chambers, Nero continued his restless pacing, each footfall a measured beat against the marble that could not silence the storm rising beyond the palace walls. Flatterers had long since melted away into the night, leaving only the echo of their empty assurances. The empire no longer held its breath. It exhaled rebellion in every province and every legion camp. Rebellion had come swiftly once the governors declared their loyalty to others. Spain and Gaul had turned first, their legions marching under banners that no longer bore Nero's name. Word reached him in fragments, each report delivered by trembling messengers who vanished as quickly as they arrived. The Praetorian Guard, the very men sworn to shield the emperor, now stood at their barracks' gates, unwilling to answer his summons. Their absence carved a deeper void than any dagger ever could. Nero halted before a tall window overlooking the darkened gardens. Moonlight spilled across the fountains, turning the water to quicksilver, yet even that cold light could not reach the fever in his thoughts. He whispered to the empty room, asking what remained of his power when armies refused his commands and friends refused his presence. The question hung there unanswered, as if the walls themselves had grown deaf. Outside Rome, the roads filled with rumors of approaching forces. Citizens who once cheered his games now barred their doors at the sound of imperial messengers. The arena spectacles had failed to bind the people to him. Instead, they had only reminded everyone how far the emperor had drifted from the needs of his realm. In the quiet that followed each failed attempt to rally support, Nero felt the weight of history pressing closer. He summoned what loyal servants remained and ordered horses prepared for flight. Yet when the moment came, the courtyard stood empty. No guards formed ranks, no chariots waited. Only the wind moved through the colonnades, carrying the distant sound of marching feet that belonged to men no longer his. The emperor's breath shortened. He paced again, this time toward the private treasury where gold still waited, but gold could not buy back allegiance once lost. A single freedman stayed at his side, offering quiet counsel that escape might still be possible if Nero reached the coast. The suggestion lingered between them like a fragile thread. Nero considered it, his mind racing through images of exile and return, yet the thread snapped when fresh news arrived. The Senate had declared him an enemy of the state. His name now carried the same curse once reserved for traitors. In the hours that followed, Nero moved through the palace like a man already half gone from it. He paused before statues of his ancestors, their marble eyes offering no judgment, only silence. The weighty quiet of those corridors pressed against him more heavily than any crowd's roar ever had. He spoke aloud to no one in particular, asking how an emperor could fall so far in so short a span. The words fell flat against the stone. Abandonment deepened with each passing watch. Even the last of his inner circle slipped away under cover of darkness, leaving behind half-eaten meals and discarded cloaks. The emperor stood alone in the great hall where once petitioners had knelt. Now only dust stirred at his feet. He felt the finality of it, a cold certainty that no flattery could soften and no denial could erase. Toward dawn, Nero retreated to a small chamber used for private reflection. There he faced the last choices left to him. Escape routes closed one by one, allies vanished, the rebellion's leaders advanced without mercy or hesitation. In that narrowing space, the emperor weighed the dignity of his end against the humiliation of capture. The silence around him grew absolute, broken only by the distant creak of gates and the soft tread of servants who dared not meet his gaze. He chose the path that would spare him the arena of public judgment. With steady hands, he prepared what was needed. The freedman who remained offered one final word of farewell, yet even that voice seemed to come from far away. Nero drew the moment out, letting the tension stretch until it could stretch no further. Then, with deliberate calm, he acted. The last breath left him in the grey light before full sunrise. Outside the palace walls, the news spread like fire through dry grass. Rome awoke to a changed order, its foundations no longer cracking beneath one man's will, but settling into new shapes, shaped by those who had outlasted him. The echo of that final silence would travel through centuries, carried in the stories of emperors who followed, and the lessons they learned from the fall of Nero.